name is Gail Holloman, former name Kashui. I was born and raised in Hanford, moved away for 30 years, came back, and the curator for the Japanese part of the exhibit.
I'm Steve Bannister, lifelong resident of Hanford, and I'm the China Alley Preservation Society, and I'm co-curating the Chinese portion of the exhibit.
Hello, I'm Ariane Wing. I'm the president of the China Alley Preservation Society. I am also a lifelong resident of Hanford. I've gone away, but I drank the water, so I came back.
This exhibit encompasses Kings County Asian experience from mid-1800s all the way up to 1945. Talks about the immigration of the Asians into the United States, in particular California, and then basically we show what the Asian experience has been reflected in Kings County.
Well, our purpose for this exhibit, of course, was to show the public, give them some of our history. I was particularly touched to be part of this exhibit because I am the president of the China Alley Preservation Society, and our museum was severely damaged by arson. And for 3 years, we have not had a home to tell our stories. And that's what I wanted to do with this exhibit, is tell the Chinese American stories.
I've been a member of the China Alley Preservation Society for about over a dozen years, but my affinity for China Alley started when I was a little boy, and my parents would be eating at the Imperial Dynasty and having a drink afterwards, and I'm ready to go home, and they'd say, "Steve, go play in the alley." And it was safe enough where you could do that. And there was a Buddha in front of the Chinese pagoda restaurant, and I used to rub its belly, and there were several Chinese restaurants in the area, and the smells were just so intriguing, and so I had a blast.
I was involved in this museum. We originally had a team of 3 to help with the Japanese side. It was a learning curve for me, and definitely a personal experience. I was born and raised here. A lot of the artifacts were destroyed when the Japanese Americans were evacuated from the West Coast, so I was amazed at how many artifacts and displays that the other members of the Buddhist church was able to gather together. I became the head curator due to time constraints on the other people, so I hope that we can share the experience and show the influence that not only the Japanese but the Chinese and other Asian cultures had or do have in Kings County. The next part will be the future experience, but the Japanese influence in Kings County before 1945 was tremendous. I was not aware of that, so it's definitely a surprise for me.
Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Chinese immigration. The early Chinese, they came over here. Well, basically, their story is no different than any other immigrant's story. They came to find a better life for themselves, and hopefully they would make enough money to go back home very wealthy and send money back to their families. So they, in the early 1800s, or during the gold rush, a lot of them came over. And of course, in this area, the Chinese were here because they were building railroads. And after the railroads were finished, they stayed in the area and they worked on the farms. And so they had made their own little community within a community. And like I said, after the railroads were built, many of the Chinese, they worked on the farms. And on one of the photographs we have here is a Jaws house that was out on one of the farms out in the country here. And that house was probably there from the 1800s and had to be removed in the early 1980s.
Real quick, what a Jaws?
A Jaws house is a place of worship, and so there was enough. They called them China camps. So there were enough Chinese laborers on the farmland where they had their own little camps, and they sort of set up their own little town. And on the weekends when they were free, they would get, I don't know, horse and buggied or wagon train flew down to what is the Chinese Chinatown, and so that where they would gamble, play mahjong, and have fun. A lot of people don't know that the Bing cherries were brought over here by the Chinese immigrants, and that's why we have Bing cherries here in California. And I grew up with Bing cherry trees in our backyard.
The Japanese and just Asians in general were known for clearing lands like swamplands. The Chinese and the Japanese and all the Asian communities, we brought in the fruits like the lemons, the lettuce, peaches, of course rice, strawberries, and oranges. The Asians were known for clearing swampland and making it productive. So the Sacramento Delta was actually swampland. They actually had contracted, a Caucasian owner had contracted with a Chinese gentleman who brought in Chinese laborers and actually cleared the delta and made it into productive land. The same with the other areas in the world that the Japanese and the Chinese and all the other Asian immigrants, the Filipinos and like the monks, they made those lands into productive land. Land that was barren, they were able to make it produce fruits or crops and make money at it. The Asians also were exposed to a lot of discrimination just because of their looks. The Chinese experienced it first. The Japanese did with the Exclusion Act and also with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. There was all sorts of laws and exclusions made for non-citizens, so the immigrants that came over weren't able to own land. They weren't able to do a lot of things. Once their children were born, they could buy land, but there was a lot of discrimination set up in both just the Japanese and the Chinese. When the Chinese Exclusion Act came through, the Japanese government was basically an isolated government, allowed more passports to come in to fill the Chinese labor gap. So they were brought over to fill the gap and take more money back to Japan. That was the initial concept, but that didn't happen.
And from 1910 to 1940s, there was an immigration station called at Angel Island, which is just out off the bay of San Francisco. And the Chinese, or Asians, but they were primarily Chinese, that was their like the Ellis Island of the West Coast. And that's where they had to stop, but they weren't treated very nicely. The men were separated from the women, so the families were torn apart, and it wasn't a quick check in and check out. Some of them were there for years before they could get questioned. And there were carvings. I don't want to say, I almost want to say prisoners, but they were there so long that they were so full of despair that they started carving these poems into the walls. And as you can see, that was their window. They didn't really have a window. That's why I keep wanting to say prisoner. I had the fortunate experience to visit Angel Island, and it's very emotional when you go there. When you see just how they had to live for that period of time. I was very fortunate. My paternal grandmother only had to just check in there because, well, the story will come in later, but a man named Su Chung-hee helped her get out of there real quick. Another personal thing as far as exclusion, my maternal grandparents, I have one grandmother who's Caucasian. My grandparents couldn't get married in the United States. They had to go to Mexico to get married, and because of the miscegenation law, and I don't think that law was repealed until 1963, where a white could not marry a non-white. This exhibit, this display, we've dedicated to Su Chung-hee. Su Chung-hee came over here in the early 1880s, and he set up shop in what is now known as China Alley. But he was such a powerful businessman and so well known that the China Alley, that street, became known as Su Chung-hee Alley. He, like I mentioned before, he's the reason why my grandmother did not have to spend too much time in Angel Island. I don't want to say he was mafia, but he was very well connected everywhere, and he was just very successful. The reason we have a canary cage, our bird cage up there, is because he collected canaries. He had over 50 canaries, and one day when he was cleaning the cages, the canaries got out, and all the people in China Alley were running up and down the alley trying to catch the birds. We had a little bit of fun getting tangled up with this map because of us weaving in and out. But we have a map here that shows all the Chinese and Japanese businesses that were in what they called the Oriental Quarter, because they used those kind of words back then. And they were very close together, and the blocks was a very hustling, bustling, busy place. And it's in Chinatown's heyday. It was on the weekends. It was elbow to elbow with people shopping, gambling, everything.
This also has, like Ariane said about the Chinese businesses, this was like a eye-opening experience for me, coming from the Japanese side, because our parents didn't talk about what happened before the war. And through interviews and documents, I found that the Japanese community was actually very vibrant and very robust. They actually occupied both sides of the street on 7th, from Harris to White. They had pool halls. We were known for pool halls versus lottery. There were barber shops. There was actually a deli, which was taken up at the top there. There was Omada's grocery store. We had a fish market. Star Cafe, which is still running, was opened in 1901. The Japanese citizens back in the 1900s actually dedicated a fountain. That fountain was taken out when World War II broke out and then reestablished once the war was done. So these were all businesses that I was aware of. There was a tofu making place. There was a udon house. There was the movie theater, which was called Victory. It was originally established by a gentleman from Guadalupe, the coast. It was called the Royal Theater. He actually had a hotel, so the stairs that were in there, for those that remember the stairs, they went upstairs to a lodging like a hotel. So there was a lot of things that I was not aware of. They have Japanese baths, just a plethora of businesses that I definitely wasn't aware of. One of the first early Japanese settlers that opened a business in Kings County was Mr. Omada. And his picture is Omada's grocery store at the top. He was at the corner of Green and 7th Street. He was actually educated here in Berkeley or Stanford, came down on his train on his way to LA to establish a business once he had graduated from high school. The train got stuck here in Kings County. So he got out, walked around and found everybody nice and friendly and decided, I'm gonna establish a business here. So he is the first grocery store that's Japanese American that opened in Kings County.
And on this little corner here, a lot of people don't know that Armona also had a very large Chinatown. In fact, at one point it rivaled Hanford's Chinatown because of all the farmland, and they had a lot of China camps there. And here we have a picture of the temple that was located in Armona, and below that is the interior of the temple. The temple no longer exists, and you wouldn't really know there used to be a Chinatown there, except there are streets named Shanghai and Canton and Lotus.
A Japanese community in Armona, just opposite of 14th, which is called Lake Street in Armona. It's actually where the Armona Donuts and the cabinet shop is at in Armona currently. That used to be a vibrant Japanese community with a sweet shop, a soda shop, a restaurant, boarding houses. Unfortunately, nothing exists in the Asian market except for the Armona Donuts, which is owned by some Asians.
This display is dedicated to all the gambling facilities that dotted China Alley. That was a very popular pastime, how the Chinese spent their time, spare time, and spent their money. At first, it was the gambling houses were just limited to Chinese, but later on in the 1940s and 50s, the other, like the Caucasians, started coming in, and they would mark their gambling tickets. This is an example of a gambling ticket. It's actually a poem that the school children memorize because none of the characters are repeated. And in the beginning, they picked the what do you want to call it? The gambling room owner. He would pick the winning numbers out of the pool. But later on, they had the hole punch where the numbers were. That's how they were picked. All of this paraphernalia here is original. It came from the gambling places in China Alley, and when I say they were everywhere, they really kind of were, because they played pai gow on the benches that were there. And almost all storefronts had a little room in the back or in the basement where they could gamble the evening away. And so everything is from China Alley gambling rooms. That makes me want to tell you one thing that I did not cover over there, but there's no picture, but I can, when I talk about, it's really sketchy. When I do research on the gambling was outlawed in Hanford, and so they were always gambling, but they always had raids. And this goes as an intro to the next subject that I want to talk about, is the China Alley tunnels, because that's when they were raided. There was, for example, we have in storage for our gambling displays. There is a wooden bench with a little button on the back where a lookout would be sitting in front of the gambling room, and he would hit the button when he saw the police officers coming, and a buzzer would go off in the gambling room, alerting everybody to hide the chips and throw everything on the ground and pretend you're just having a cup of tea and reading the paper. A lot of the gamblers, they fled. They either had a very small, narrow tunnel, because these tunnels, the few that existed, were they were tunnels. And so they could go out to the street. When also the tunnels, what I think people misconstrue as a tunnel is that a lot of the buildings are very narrow and deep, and they all have very narrow, deep basements, and a lot of the basements were interconnected to each other, and that gives it a kind of a tunnel-like feel. For instance, somebody watching this might be acquainted with the Imperial Dynasty wine cellar, for example. That was a tunnel, a partial into a tunnel, partial opening into a tunnel. But then it was only so wide and so deep. But there is no tunnel village people. I've had people ask me, well, what about the people that lived in the tunnels? There are no village tunnel people. Or that the tunnels went all the way to 7th Street. I don't know why someone would want to waddle like that all the way. You just walk down the street. So there wasn't this intricate network of tunnels. Yes, they did exist, but they weren't an intricate design. And when the Wing family was remodeling in 1958 and adding on to their restaurants and building the Imperial Dynasty, 3 tunnels were found, and they were all filled up. No tunnels exist today. And that's how I wanted to say they ran onto the tunnels, but they didn't run out to Armona. The tunnel did not go all the way to San Francisco. It did not go all the way to Armona. It didn't even go across the street. This is a banner from the Armona Temple. It says holy boundless longevity, but the first character is upside down. Why is the first character upside down? It was a restoration project gone bad. The person who was trying to put the character back on the banner did not read Chinese and didn't know how to put the character on. So but we're fortunate that we have it, because there's not much left of the Armona Temple. This is one of the few artifacts that we have from it.
King's Hand Laundry. It was actually purchased in about 1911 by the Takagawa family, which Naomi, everyone would know who Naomi is because she was such an icon in the community. Her dad and mom bought the laundry building. They came over from Japan and established this building. The building still stands today, and they're working on restoring it and making it to a museum. It's actually been operational since the early 1900s. Was closed during the war when they were interned in Jerome, and reopened after that. The photo there is one of the main pictures that was taken in the early 1900s by a photographer that came through Kings County. Otherwise, we would not have had a lot of these pictures. The picture up on top is Naomi, her father, mother, and her older sister Susie. The next one over here, number 4, is her sister Susie and Naomi. She's quite a few years older than Naomi is. And the one down here is of Naomi when she was in the relocation center in Jerome, standing in the snow. The artifacts here are from the hand laundry. They were preserved. And so these were the original items that they used for the hand laundry, for mending clothes, for pressing things. As you know, you want to build some muscles, you could pick up an iron, truly iron. This machine was rather unique. Back then, everyone thought that nuclear medicine or nuclear items was healthy for you. So it was a wash where they could actually wash clothes in nuclear water and give it back to you, thinking that it was healthy. And when I heard the other day with one of the other people that came in as a visitor, she said, I remember my mom giving me something that was like a nuclear material and had me drink it because back then it was healthy for you. Now we know better. We have maps of the Asian Pacific area that we're dealing with in this period, which would be but primarily China and Japan. The visitors that have come in to visit the museum, we've been asked them to pinpoint your ancestors if they knew where their families came from. So, as you can see, we've had quite a few. So we have from Japan and China. So it's kind of an interesting one because people will, good thing for we have Google because they can look up what area of China or Japan they came from. It looks nice.
And on in the beginning of displays, it says most of the Chinese immigrants came from the Guangdong province. And as you can see, this is around here, this is where the Chinese that settled in here are mostly from this area. That's my pin right there. This case is really dedicated to the Harry Lee family. Harry Lee was an herbalist on China Alley, and he was, like Su Chunky, he was a very well-liked, very prominent citizen. And he had the Chun Su Herb Company building, and his family put together some of their family memorabilia. This display is trying to replicate the Taoist Temple that was the hub in China Alley. The Taoist Temple was built in 1882, and it's a two-story building. The bottom level, we call it the main level, served as for the single Chinese men. It was almost like what do you call it, a hostel, where they stayed. And upstairs was a kind of a multi-purpose room. It served as a meeting place, it served as a place of worship, and at the rear of the second floor, it also served as a schoolroom. And in the Taoist religion, there is no really set time or space. There's not a minister or a main person. Our culture is very ancestral oriented, and so what we're normally doing is we're paying homage to our ancestors, because if they're happy up there, we're going to be happy down. They're going to make sure we're happy down here. And so there's ceremonial incense, and there's also we call them joss papers, because you fold them up and they're gold leaf, and it's like you say your prayers and you go to the incinerator, and then the gold is set up to the ancestors. And nowadays the papers also come in shapes of like a Maserati or a BMW. They come in whatever they might need. They also clothes. There's money. Real fake money, and whatever your ancestors' heart's desires want. There's also what we call the tongue sung, and it is you take the joss sticks and you shake them, and you what do you want? Maybe I want to say, what does Steve want to get me for my anniversary? And so I'm shaking it, and the stick that falls out, I look it up into that book, and it might give me a hint. Again, it's I'm trying to think what I'm trying to say, so I won't say it. But the rear picture in the back is how the temple looked in the 1880s. The two stools right there, they are from the temple, and they're from the 1880s, these little stools, and that's, as you can see, and that's what they sat on, and that's what the school children used as well. This exhibit is dedicated to Richard Wing and his service with General George C. Marshall. Richard Wing worked in his father's restaurant when he was 6 years old, and when he grew up, his college studies were interrupted because of war, and he enlisted in the Army. When he was stationed at Camp Roberts, I'll tell you a little interesting story about his time at Camp Roberts. He and some other Chinese soldiers, they were doing their thing and bragging about how thin they could slice the bread. And the one soldier said, well, I can slice this into 62. And Richard Wing said, well, I can make 118. And so the bets came, and the men started slicing their bread. And Richard Wing won. He made 123 slices. And the Chinese soldiers, Chinese American soldiers, after dinner or later at night, they'd have what they call suyu, which is a late night snack. Word of these late night snacks got around, and so the other officers started paying visits. Well, one afternoon, Richard Wing received a word that he had to go to the headquarters, the main office, and then to pack up, and he was gone on an airplane. He didn't know what the heck was going on, but he landed in Washington, D.C. and found out he was going to be General George C. Marshall's personal chef. And later he became his food taster when he was traveling all over the world with the general. He had to learn not only the protocol of being the aide-de-camp to a general, but he had to learn all about toxins and food poisoning, because someone might try to poison the general, and General Marshall was allergic to shellfish, strawberries, and garlic. So you had to watch out for those things. And Richard had for him, it was the highlight of his career life, I think. The way he talked about it, he kept every single thing. Even after he was discharged, he corresponded with the Marshalls, and he kept every single letter. And he donated all of his correspondence and a lot of his memorabilia to the General Marshall Foundation in Lexington, Kentucky. And so here we have a couple pictures of Richard Wing and the General, and a copy of a letter from General Marshall and a copy of a letter from the General Marshall Foundation. This is a case about the Chinese community. There were between 500 and 800 families that lived in Chinatown during its peak. And it's always nice when the Taoist Temple Museum was open, that we would have descendants like from 4 generations later come in and say, that's my grandmother or my grandfather, because their roots started here in Hanford.
This is an exhibit on the Go for Broke unit, which was the all-Nisei Japanese-American regiment that was put together for World War II by Colonel Pettigrew. The Go for Broke unit on this side is basically for the 442 that went into the European theater. They lost many, many members. They were known best for rescuing the Lost Battalion in France. It was a group of Texans, and they lost 800 men in their company to rescue 200 Texans. They were actually not told the purpose of their visit by taking this steep hill until 3 days later. Once they were told what the purpose of their goal was to get to the top of the mountain to rescue these Texans, they made it up there in less than 24 hours. So it was the concept that they just weren't told, or the higher ups didn't think that they could understand. The 442 and the 100th and the Military Intelligence Service still remains the most decorated unit in military history for the amount of people that were in the units. And that record still stands today. The other part of the European theater was in the Pacific theater. This was one of America's secret weapons. It was the military intelligence section. It was not really, my dad was one of them. He didn't talk about it until the 70s. And even in the 70s, he didn't talk about it. They were sworn to secrecy. because they had too many secrets and they had intelligence. And this division actually still exists today. They weren't released from their vow of secrecy until the Freedom of Information Act came around the 1970s. The big book here is a huge dictionary that has Japanese, Chinese, and English. My father actually had a Bible that was in English and in Japanese and Chinese. There's also a pocket dictionary here. They actually had a lot of things. And this is a picture of my dad. He was one of the people that wanted other people to know about what they did and how they helped solve the war. They shortened the war by about 2 years. So he advocated, and he went to talk to schools and let them know what an important part that the military intelligence actually played. They actually interrogated people in the Pacific. They translated documents. They translated maps. Again, they interrogated prisoners. My dad actually did an interview with the Hanford Sentinel about what we used to call a Yankee samurai. One of the main things that they did was they were able to decipher the Japanese documents and found out when Admiral Yamamoto was going into New Guinea, they were actually able to kill him en route. So without the intelligence, they wouldn't have known that he was landing. This is one of the flyers that they dropped throughout Japan. It's been translated. It basically tells the Japanese citizens, please take this to your superiors. You guys are losing the war, you may as well give up. So they tried all sorts of intelligence. There was also a record that the Japanese were working on an atomic bomb. They actually had 2 interpreters in Washington, D.C. at 2 separate locations deciphering Japanese technical documents to make sure they knew what was going on with the war. Fortunately, the Japanese didn't come up with a nuclear bomb. But the Japanese actually abandoned their post thinking that all the documents would not be able to be deciphered or readable, not knowing that they had interpreters going in there and helping to figure out what their documents were in the maps. Troop movements, they had diaries. They were good at making diaries, so they had diaries. Both the 442 and the Military Intelligence Service received the Congressional Medal of Honors, so those were awarded. This display or exhibit is of the military personnel specifically from Kings County. It's not the full complement of those that served in the military from Kings County. These were actually photographs gathered from senior photos from 1935 to 1942 at Hanford High only. The people on this side are mostly for the 442. They served in the European theater. They were the ones that participated in the Lost Battalion. This gentleman here graduated from Hanford High School. He's one of the people that died in that battalion run. There was also another gentleman from Hawaii that came. And a lot of these guys, some of them were already in the service because they were drafted. All the other branches of the service gave them other than dishonorable discharge because they were Asians and they felt that they couldn't be of service. Colonel Pettigrew knew that the Japanese Americans would be a great fighting force, so he petitioned to get the Go for Broke unit established. He was able to convince those higher up in the military that yes, they would be a great group. So between the Hawaiians and the Japanese Americans, which a lot of them, if they weren't already in the Army, because the Army elected to keep their Japanese Americans in the force, like this one here is my dad. He was in the Army, he was at Camp Roberts. He actually joined the military intelligence side. They served the European or the Pacific theater. They served in batches of maybe 2 to 10 people. They didn't want to concentrate a whole lot in the same spot. In the European theater, there were several different companies for the Japanese American. They were known for giving their all. That's why they were called the Go for Broke. So between the Hawaiians and the Japanese Americans, they were going to win. They actually, I found out recently, was once they had rescued the Lost Battalion in France, part of them were ordered to go to Dachau. They actually freed and established contact with one of the first prisoner of war camps in Germany. They were not allowed to disclose that they had actually found the camp first, so they let another Caucasian group come in and take credit. But they were actually ordered under secrecy to go and help and secure it because they wanted a unit that they could trust. So that was kind of a surprising fact that I learned on Sunday from one of the other attendees. So the ones that were actually when they went into the the relocation camps, a lot of these people volunteered out of camp. The gentleman from Hawaii volunteered out of camp. So a lot of these weren't forced. They felt it was their duty to protect the United States and the families.
So can you go into a bit about the details, since we're going to merge over, why they call it the Lost Battalion? So just, yeah.
It was the Lost Battalion because they were actually stranded on the top of a hill. If you look at Beyond the Lens with Jeff Aiello, he actually did a series, he did a spot or an episode where he actually went to France intentionally to look at the hill and the area where the Lost Battalion was. So he showed you the steepness of the hill that these soldiers had to climb to get up there. They were called the Lost Battalion because they really weren't, they had no way of getting out. And so they thought that they were going to be lost. So they sent the 442 in to rescue them. And if they had told the 442 the purpose of a lot of their missions, it would have gotten done a lot sooner. This gentleman, Hachiro Miyake, he actually he had his 99th birthday or 100th birthday earlier this year, about May. He still lives in Gardena. He was in the military intelligence side. One significant person, which I didn't have his picture of, is Shiro Omada. He was actually one of the interpreters for General MacArthur. This exhibit is of the Hanford Buddhist Church. It was established in the early 1900s. The portrait in the back is of the original church that was built before the war. It does have a reverse swastika on the top, and it's an ancient symbol originating from the Middle Easterns, like the Persian areas. It's meant to be peace and harmony. If you reverse it, then it has the German interpretation. The black shrine back there, it's what we call an Obutsudon. It's basically what we have for small families, so you can honor your relatives once they pass. That's what we have. We have a picture here way back when, until about the 1970s. We always had gatherings and we had panoramic pictures. Panoramic pictures were the biggest thing. The number 8 is a ceremony of celebration for grand openings or for anniversaries in which the children are dressed up and they parade through town.
All right, you want to move in?
What we have here is Japanese culture, a little bit of everything. The tall mannequin has a Japanese wedding dress. It's actually hand sewn. We have a Japanese handmade dress here. This was given as a wedding gift to Nancy and Harry Mia when they got married. We have a little bit of everything. We have a tea set. We have some of the foods. We have the shogun helmet. There are the kendo sticks. The two portraits in the back show you how Americanized our ancestors got. That's a picture of my grandmother and my grandmother, our grandmother and grandfather on my mother's side. Around 1920s, the small picture is a picture of my uncle. So it's they aren't dressed in the traditional Japanese, they're more Americanized. We also had Japanese schools in Kings County. This is just a kimono that shows that that was actually handmade. A lot of our kimonos are handmade. My grandmother made that. We had Japanese schools. This board tells about the basic characters. And that is a picture of the Japanese school that was actually on the map in the 1925. There were 4 Japanese schools, the one on Phillips and White. There was also one that broke off of this over on Phillips. They eventually merged with this original school once the attendance in the Phillips school had reduced. There was also a Japanese school in Armona in the community hall, and there was also a Japanese school in the Buddhist church. So that I was not aware of. So when the war came, everyone came back after the war, it was something that was not established due to this stigma.
So what was taught in the Japanese schools?
Language, culture, it's like most immigrant cultures where you get together with the church. You have the language, you have the writing, you have reading, you have culture, you have basically everything that relates to the Japanese culture, similar like the Chinese. When the Chinese school, there are things that you do with the Chinese and any other, even with the new immigrants that are coming in. That's where I pride the Hmongs in being able to preserve their culture.
This display is about the Chinese school. The Chinese, it was very, very important as soon as there were children in Chinatown that they keep the knowledge of their mother language and the reading and writing, that they want to make sure their children kept a little of that homeland in their world that was here in Hanford. And so originally the school started in the back room of the second floor of the Taoist Temple, and it outgrew that, and it ended up then in the basement of the Su Chen Tea store, and it outgrew that. And so they were looking to build a Chinese school where it would be large enough to house all of the children that wanted to go to school. Actually, their parents were sending them to school. And so in 1923, this school was built. The land was donated by two Chinese gentlemen that owned the property, and a couple of the other Chinatown businessmen donated money, and they collected money, and including the lottery, the gambling rooms, they had to donate a percentage of their profits to the building of this school. So this Chinese school is the first school in California that was built by a lottery. The children, they went to Chinese school after they went to their Western school. They attended Chinese school. The younger ones attended Chinese school from the hours of 4 to 6, and then they wrote for dinner. The older ones had an hour dinner break and came back for another hour of Chinese lessons. After World War II, the Chinese population in Hanford started to dwindle, and there weren't that many children to be attending school, and the school closed in 1962. But the building still stands today. Well, this is Mei Junlo, which is translated as beautiful and precious restaurant. This is a story of one of the early Chinese pioneers named Gong Ting-shu. Gong Ting-shu did not know he was coming to Hanford, California. He was a very political, rabble-rousing Chinese person in China. He hated the Qing dynasty. He spoke all the time against the Qing dynasty. He cut off his queue, his ponytail, because that was what that government made show them that they were theirs, that having them wear that queue. And so Gong Ting-shu encouraged other men to cut it off as well. And he was at a political rally one day, and the Qing dynasty henchmen were watching him, and he saw them, and they started to chase him. And so he ran, and he ran and ran and ran until he could run no more, because he came to the beginning of the Pearl River. So he couldn't do anything but jump into the river. He was rescued, and his fellow passengers were coming to the United States of America to work on the railroads. And so he ended up in San Francisco. Records show that he spent some time in Kingston and Grangeville before he ended up in Hanford, California, where he started to sell noodles out of the basement of his home that is located on 64 Visalia Street. When he jumped in the river, he left his wife and 5 children behind, because he could never return back to China because he would be executed. He came here and started with nothing, but he left in China 23 acres of rice paddies and a small eatery. He had a nice life there, except for the government. Anyway, so he built his restaurant at 6.5 China Alley. The building still stands there today. In the around 1910, 1911, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who became known as the first president of China, was procuring his monies and support for his campaign, and he stopped here in Hanford. And he wasn't going to stay here very long, but he had heard wind that a rival faction was in Tulare and was going to try to hunt him down. Gong Ting-shu was more than happy to hide him in a loft in his restaurant for 4 days. And so that's the story of Gong Ting-shu. This display is dedicated to all the herbalists in Chinatown. There were probably half a dozen herbalists at one time, and they were all very, very busy. This one, most of the herbs are from the first and oldest herbalist in Hanford, and his name was Lok Ting Su. He came to Hanford because of businessman Su Chung Hee. He had a very ill grandson, and nothing was helping him, and so Su Chung Hee sent for Dr. Su to come to Hanford, and he cured his ailing grandson. And Dr. Su Chung Hee was so happy and thankful that he set up shop for LT Su. And the herbalists and the gambling were what brought a lot of outsiders, non-Chinese people into Chinatown. Because even though if the Western medicine wasn't working, I mean, pain will make you try anything. So they would come and visit the herbalists in Chinatown. And they would start off they would feel your pulse and kind of check behind there wasn't any stethoscope or anything, they just felt your pulse. And they would ask about your symptoms and talk to you, look at your tongue, look at your eyes. And then they would gather the herbs, they would weigh the herbs, and then they would wrap them up in the paper, brown paper, and parcel it out with your prescription. We have a prescription pad from Dr. Su on the table here. And you would go home and drink the medicine. And they were all very, very successful. Probably, again, after the Chinese population declined after World War II, the herbalists sort of faded out as well, although all of their buildings, except for one, still stand. And all of the artifacts in here came from the original herbalist shops. And so some of them are probably over 100 years old. And Dr. Su, most of the herbalists lived above or behind their shops. So what reason there's photograph records there is because when we opened out the LT Su herb building, it was like he had gone home one night and never came back. And there were his hat, his glasses, everything was on the table, and records and his everything. So it was his home, is now our home.
This particular exhibit is of the Japanese Presbyterian Church. A lot of them, some were Buddhist. Actually, the Presbyterian Church was prevalent in Japan. So when they came over, they either joined the Presbyterian Church here, and those that weren't Presbyterian found the residents here, especially from the Presbyterian Church, warm and welcoming and helpful. So they elected to stay with the Presbyterian churches versus joining the Buddhist church. Japan did send ministers or reverends over here from the Presbyterian church. This building was actually on 7th Street, and once the population actually diminished, they actually merged with the other Presbyterian church, which is existing on Irwin. So that's why you're going to have a lot of population of Asians with the Presbyterian church, because they were so welcoming and it was easier for them to integrate. That also helped the Japanese Americans when they went off to the intern camps. For example, that's how the Takagawas were able to retain their properties. This display here is of Henry Sugimoto. For those that aren't familiar with him, he is a famous Japanese artist. He was not born and raised in Hanford, but his father did come to Hanford, settled here, worked, sent for his wife. So the wife was here. Henry and his brother stayed in Japan. They stayed with her grandparents or her parents. Her father was a samurai warrior that when the new Meiji restoration came through, he actually moved to the country. So if you know the movie Last Samurai, he was one of those samurais that was exiled. So he lived in the country, had lots of art, and he encouraged Henry to sketch the art. And that's where he got his passion for drawing. This is a picture of him teaching art in Jerome concentration camp, because that's where he was sent when the war broke out. This is actually a wood block where they actually carved out of wood a reverse image. It's an image of he, his wife, and his daughter Madeline with a little baby when they arrived in Jerome, Arkansas, very despondent. He actually he graduated from Hanford High in the 20s. Max Nichols' father took a liking to him, helped him get into the dentistry school in Berkeley. He decided he didn't want to do dentistry, so he found his passion was art. So he got his degree in art, went to Europe to learn from the masters, came back to California during the Great Depression because his parents needed help. So he helped his parents, and he went to marry his sweetheart, which was Naomi Takagawa's sister Susie. He worked in the laundry and helped the family there. He actually taught Japanese classes at the Buddhist church at night, and he taught art classes in high school and to other students in the area. So he was always teaching art and expanding everyone's knowledge. The hanging koi fish is a celebration that the Japanese have. Before it used to be what we call Boys' Day, but in the 1980s they combined the Boys and Girls' Day into one holiday called Children's Day. So if you take a look at the flags that are flying, the father would be in black, the mother would be in red or pink, and then the other children, depending upon whether they were male or female, would have smaller flags flying underneath them. So in the beginning, if you look at someone that's an old flag, it would be just basically a boys' day is what it was originally, back in like the 50s or 60s. Want to go back to the kimonos? We have two kimonos up on the top here, which were designed for the fancy dressing, would be for dances or for formal occasions. They're actually outfitted with the obis, which is a sash that goes around there. Some of them have the ones that are tucked in, like the one in the Japanese dancing one. And this one back here has a bow. Usually if you're younger, like a teenager, you would have a bow. That's changed nowadays. And if you were married, or if you have an older woman, it would look like a cushion in the back. So those are just some samples of what the kimonos look like.
Well, I really enjoyed putting this part of the exhibit together. As I mentioned earlier, we haven't had a place to tell our stories for almost 3 years, and it was incredibly gratifying to find our old friends and see familiar faces as we took them out of storage boxes and were able to set them up. And I'm really looking forward to setting up the next phase, because that's going to be even more exciting.
Well, for me, this was a fulfilling and very eye-opening and just experience. It was deeply heartfelt. I'm glad that I was able to get the community to participate in many of the items and the stories, and it's an untold story that my ancestors and our predecessors didn't want to share, either due to not wanting to because of the way the culture and the atmosphere was back then for Asians, but it's an experience that needs to be shared with everyone, and I hope people learned, and I hope they come to part 2, because this is an extension of this part, so it shows the exhibit from 1945 to current. And there's been a lot of change, and we look forward to putting it together. It should be interesting.
No, I'm just looking for the next segment as well. We've already done a lot of the narratives, and it's going to be great.